Something is wrong with Apophis, and the closer we look, the stranger it gets. We have measured its orbit so precisely that we can tell you where it will be on a single Friday evening 4 years from now, down to the kilometre. And yet when we look at the rock itself, the numbers stop making sense. It is too light to be solid. It tumbles in a way a normal rock should not. Its own shape looks like two pieces barely holding together. And in 2029, the Earth is going to pull on that fragile body harder than anything has in millions of years. The scientists who study it are not afraid it will hit us. They are nervous because they genuinely do not know what it will do. If you want the real answer underneath the viral panic, subscribe to the Sky Lab and give this video a like so more people find it. Drop a comment telling me whether you think Apophis is hiding something. Let's dive in. Part 1. The night something reaches down from the sky. On the evening of April 13th, 2029, a few billion people are going to look up at the sky and watch a point of light move. Not a plane with its blinking rhythm, not a satellite sliding silently along its track. This light will be sliding too, but faster, drifting against the fixed stars at a pace your eye can actually follow, and it will be brighter than almost anything else up there, brighter than the stars that draw the handle of the Big Dipper. And the unsettling part, the part that should make the hair on your arm stand up a little, is that the light will not be a light at all. It will be a rock the size of a skyscraper falling past your planet close enough to touch the orbits of our own machines. We have never seen this before. Not once in all of recorded human history has an object this large come this close to Earth, while we knew it was coming. There have been bigger rocks, and there have been closer ones, but never both at the same time, never with years of warning, never with the whole world able to step outside and witness it, with nothing but their own eyes. For the people standing in the right place that night, across Europe, across Africa, across the western edge of Asia, it will be a single evening they remember for the rest of their lives. Roughly 2 billion of them will be able to see it without a telescope, without binoculars, without anything but a clear sky and the willingness to look up. The numbers behind that moment are difficult to hold in your head, so let me put them somewhere you can feel them. At its closest, this object will pass about 31,600 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. That is closer than the ring of satellites we depend on every single day, the ones that carry our television signals and our weather data, and a good portion of our communications. Those satellites orbit at roughly 35,700 kilometers. This asteroid is going to slip beneath them. It is going to come in under the highest things we have ever parked in the sky, threading between us and our own technology at about 1/10 of the distance to the Moon. On a cosmic scale, that is not a near miss. That is a brush against the skin. Let me give you a sense of how rare this is, because rarity is the whole reason this matters. Small rocks, the size of a car or a bus, pass between the Earth and the Moon all the time. We catch a few every month, and most of them we never even notice until they are already gone. But an object the size of Apophis, something that spans 340 meters or more coming this close, is a different category of event entirely. Statistically, a body of this size only passes this near to Earth about once every 7,500 years. That is not once in a lifetime. That is once in the span of recorded civilization. The last time something this large came this close, there were no cities, no writing, no telescopes, no one to understand what they were looking at. We are the first generation of humans who will get to see this happen and actually know what it is. I want you to really picture what that evening will look like, because it is not what most people imagine when they hear the word asteroid. There will be no fireball, no streak, no tail. Apophis is not entering our atmosphere, it is passing above it. What you will see instead is a single, steady point of light, like a star that somehow came loose from its place, gliding across the constellations. Over the course of an hour or so, it will travel a noticeable distance against the background sky, fast enough that if you look away and look back, it will have moved. It will be a little like watching the International Space Station cross overhead, except this is not a spacecraft the size of a football field in low orbit. This is a mountain of rock, tens of thousands of kilometers out, and it will be brighter and more deliberate than almost anything you have ever watched move through the night. And here is the part that should give you pause. To make a thing that far away appear that bright to your naked eye, it has to be enormous, and it has to be close. Think about the scale for a moment. 340 meters is longer than 3 American football fields laid end to end. It is taller than the Eiffel Tower, taller than the Empire State Building if you stood it on its end. This is not a pebble. This is the kind of object that, in another version of history on another trajectory, would be a civilization-level threat. And that is precisely why it once frightened us so badly, and precisely why, even now that we know it will miss, we cannot quite look away from it. So sit with the strangeness of our situation. We have, parked 4 years in our future, a guaranteed appointment with a skyscraper-sized rubble pile, an appointment we can predict to the kilometre and the minute, and yet we are showing up to that appointment knowing where the visitor will stand and almost nothing about who or what is actually arriving. We know its address. We do not know its character, and rather than simply admire the view, the scientific world is quietly preparing to treat that evening as something else entirely, a laboratory, a one-time experiment, with the Earth as the apparatus and the god of chaos as the specimen. The object has a name, and whoever chose it was not in a gentle mood. It is called Apophis. In the old Egyptian stories, Apophis, sometimes written as Apep, was the great serpent of darkness and chaos, the thing that waited each night in the underworld to swallow the sun and end the world. Every morning the sun fought its way past the serpent and rose anyway, and every night the battle began again. That is the name we hung on this rock, and in a detail that no screenwriter would dare to invent. The day it makes its closest pass, the day the serpent comes nearest to swallowing us, falls on a Friday the 13th. Now, I want to be very careful and very honest with you right at the start, because this is the part most people get wrong and the part that matters most. Apophis is not going to hit us. I am not going to spend the next 2 hours teasing you toward a secret impact, because there isn't one. The path of this asteroid is one of the most precisely measured trajectories of any object in the solar system, and the people whose entire job is to worry about this have run the numbers and run them again, and ruled out a collision with Earth for at least the next 100 years. The orbit is not the mystery. You can sleep tonight. So why am I telling you that scientists are starting to get nervous? Why is there a quiet tension building in the planetary science community as this date approaches? A tension that has very little to do with the orbit and everything to do with the asteroid itself. Because here is the thing we don't talk about enough. We know exactly where Apophis will be on that Friday night, down to the kilometre. We know almost nothing about what it actually is. We know its address, not its character. And in the last few years, as our instruments have gotten better and our models have gotten sharper, the picture that has come back is strange. The shape is strange. The way it spins is strange. And the deeper anyone looks, the more it seems that this thing is not the solid mountain of stone we once pictured. Something about Apophis is off, and the people who study it know it. Because here is what is really going to happen on April 13th, 2029, underneath the beautiful light show. As Apophis falls past the Earth, our planet's gravity is going to reach up and grab it. Not gently, not symbolically. The same force that holds you in your chair and pulls the tide up the beach is going to take hold of a 340-metre asteroid and squeeze it, stretch it, and twist it, in a way it has not been touched in possibly millions of years. We are, whether we intended to or not, about to run an experiment on the god of chaos. Earth is the hand. Apophis is the thing being held. And the unsettling truth at the centre of this entire story is that nobody, not the modelers, not the mission planners, not the people who have studied this rock for 20 years, knows exactly how it is going to respond. There is a reason we cannot simply settle this with a calculation and skip the drama, and it is worth saying plainly right at the start. The behaviour of Apophis in 2029 depends on the one property we cannot measure from a distance, the arrangement and the strength of its interior. You can point every telescope on Earth at it, bounce radar off it for years, and you still cannot see inside a solid object, hundreds of millions of kilometres away. The inside gives up nothing on its own. So the answer to what Apophis will do is not sitting in the equation waiting to be solved. It is locked inside the rock, and the only key that turns the lock is force, real force, applied to the real body, with us watching what happens. That is a rare and almost old-fashioned situation in modern science. We are not going to deduce the answer. We are going to provoke it, and then watch. That is the nervousness. It is not the fear that it will strike us. It is the suspense of a one-time experiment, performed on a famous and poorly understood object, in front of the entire world, with no chance to rehearse and no way to undo it. We get one pass, one night, and whatever Apophis does when Earth takes hold of it, it will do once, and we will either be watching closely enough to understand it or we will miss our only chance. So that is where we're going tonight. We are going to look at what this object actually is, and how it went from a number that genuinely frightened astronomers to a rock we have learned to predict. We're going to look at its shape, which should not look the way it does. We're going to look at the way it tumbles through space, which does not match what a simple solid rock should do, and which a lot of people online have noticed and are arguing about right now. We're going to walk through exactly what Earth's gravity is going to do to it, step by step, and the range of things that could happen, from the boring to the genuinely astonishing. And we are going to meet the machines and the eyes that will be watching when it does. But it all comes back to one question, and I want you to keep this question in your mind for the next 2 hours, because everything we look at is going to circle back to it. What is actually inside Apophis? Not its surface, not its orbit, but its hidden interior, the part no telescope has ever seen and no spacecraft has ever touched. Because the answer to that question is the answer to everything else. It decides what happens in 2029, and the strangest part of all is that we may not get the answer until the moment the experiment is already underway. So let's start with the rock itself, and with the night, years ago now, when Apophis first appeared on our screens, with a number beside it that made very serious people very quiet. Part 2, the asteroid that once had a number, next to Earth's name. The story of Apophis begins on a desert mountaintop in Arizona on the 19th of June 2004. That date matters more than it might seem, and I will come back to why in a moment. On that night, at Kitt Peak National Observatory, 3 astronomers, Roy Tucker, David Tholen, and Fabrizio Bernardi, picked up a faint-moving dot in their data, a new near-Earth asteroid, one of hundreds discovered every year. There was nothing in that first sighting to suggest it would become the most famous asteroid on Earth. It was just another point of light, catalogued and passed along for follow-up observations like all the others. The name came later, and the story behind it is more playful than you might expect for an object that would briefly terrify the planet. When a newly discovered asteroid has its orbit confirmed, the discoverers earn the right to name it. The team that found this one were fans of a science fiction television series in which the chief villain, a parasitic alien posing as a god, was named Apophis, after the ancient Egyptian deity. So the name arrived first as a nod to a TV villain, and only afterward did everyone realise how unnervingly well the older meaning fit. Because the original Apophis in Egyptian myth was not just any god. It was the serpent of the underworld, the embodiment of chaos and dissolution, the creature that lay in wait each night to devour the sun and unmake creation, and that had to be fought off before every sunrise. We gave a rock that might hit the earth, the name of the thing the ancient world believed was always trying to end the world. The name was half a joke, the myth made it a prophecy, and for a brief window the prophecy had numbers behind it, which is what made it so chilling. To understand why a probability of 2.7% caused such alarm, you have to understand that scale I mentioned, the Torino scale, a little better. It was designed to communicate asteroid risk to the public, running from 0, a total non-event, to 10, a certain collision capable of global catastrophe. Most asteroids that ever get a rating sit at 0 or 1 and quietly fall back to 0 as more observations come in. The scale is built so that climbing it is hard and falling off it is the normal outcome. Apophis did not quietly fall. It climbed. It reached a 4, a level defined as a close encounter meriting attention by astronomers, with a real, if still small, chance of a regional disaster. No object had ever been rated that high before, and in the years since, none has matched it. For a few days around the end of 2004, the most dangerous object humanity had ever catalogued had a name borrowed from the god of chaos, and a date already fixed on the calendar, the 13th of April 2029. You can understand why people remembered it, and here is the small, strange coincidence I promised. The day I am telling you this story, the day this video goes up, is the 19th of June. Apophis was discovered exactly 22 years ago, to the day. There is no cosmic meaning in that, it is just the calendar lining up. But it is a reminder that this object has been sitting in our catalogues, watched and re-watched, for more than 2 decades, and in all that time we have refined its path to extraordinary precision while the rock itself has stayed a stranger. It did not stay quiet for long after discovery. As more observations came in during late 2004, the people calculating its orbit started to see something that does not happen often and that they very much do not like to see. The projected path of this asteroid, years into the future, kept passing closer and closer to Earth, and the uncertainty in those early measurements was wide enough that the word impact stopped being theoretical. By late December of that year, the calculated probability that Apophis would strike the Earth on its 2029 approach had climbed to about 2.7%. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because 2.7% might not sound like much. It is less than 3 chances in 100, but this is not a coin flip or a weather forecast. This is the probability that a 300-meter asteroid would hit the planet you're standing on. Imagine being told there is a roughly 1 in 37 chance that a rock large enough to flatten a metropolitan area or raise a tsunami across an ocean will arrive on a specific date that you can already circle on a calendar. Astronomers have a scale for exactly this kind of threat called the Torino scale, which runs from 0, meaning no concern at all, up to 10, meaning a certain global catastrophe. Apophis climbed to a 4. That is the highest any asteroid has ever been rated before or since. A 4 had never been assigned before, and it has never been assigned again. For a short window, this object held the record for the most dangerous rock we had ever found. Then it got more complicated, in a way that is worth understanding because it tells you how careful these calculations have to be. Even after the odds of a 2029 impact were ruled out, a subtler danger remained. There was a possibility that during the 2029 pass, Apophis might fly through a very specific, very small region of space that scientists call a keyhole. A keyhole is a kind of gravitational trap. It is a patch no more than about 0.8 of a kilometre wide, and if an asteroid threads through that exact patch, Earth's gravity bends its path by just the right amount to line it up for a collision on a later trip around the Sun. So the question was, not only will it miss us in 2029, the question became, will it miss us cleanly, or will it pass through the one small doorway that would send it back to hit us in 2036 or 2068? For a few years, that keyhole kept Apophis on the watch lists. It is a genuinely unsettling idea that a body could miss you by a wide margin and yet pass through an invisible point that seals your fate decades later. But this is also where the system worked exactly as it is supposed to. Astronomers kept watching. They gathered more data, refined the orbit, narrowed the uncertainties, and in March of 2021, using the enormous radar dish at the Goldstone Complex in California, along with other observatories, they pinned the path down with such precision that they were able to do something rare and reassuring. They cleared it completely. The radar data ruled out any impact from Apophis for at least the next 100 years. The odds of the 2036 encounter causing a strike fell to about 1 in a billion. The odds for 2068 to roughly 1 in a million. The serpent, for now, has no path to us. Let me make that keyhole idea concrete, because it is one of the most counterintuitive concepts in all of orbital mechanics, and it is worth holding in your head. Imagine you're standing on one side of a golf course, and far across the green there is a single open window in the wall of a distant clubhouse, and beyond that window, much farther still, is the hole. To sink the shot, your ball has to pass through that one specific window, miss the window by even a little, and the ball sails harmlessly past the clubhouse, and the hole is never in danger. A gravitational keyhole works the same way. It is a tiny patch of space, less than a kilometre across, and only if Apophis flew through that exact patch in 2029 would Earth's gravity bend its path into the precise new orbit that brings it back to strike us years later. Everywhere else, and the patch is surrounded by an enormous everywhere else. The asteroid passes by and the future stays safe. For a few years, the question was simply whether we could measure the path finely enough to know if it threads the window. And we could. To pull that off, the astronomers had to account for a force so subtle that most people have never heard of it, and it is a force that turns out to matter for our story in a second way. It is called the Yarkovsky effect. Here is the idea. An asteroid sitting in sunlight absorbs heat on its daytime side, and then, as it rotates, it carries that warm patch around and radiates the heat away into space a little later, in a slightly different direction. radiating heat, believe it or not, produces a tiny push, like the faintest possible exhaust. Over years and decades, that whisper of a push can nudge an asteroid's orbit by a meaningful amount. For Apophis, measuring the Yarkovsky push was essential to nailing down whether it would thread the keyhole. But notice what that same effect quietly tells us. How strongly the Yarkovsky push acts on a body depends on how it holds and releases heat, which depends on what its surface and interior are made of. The very measurement that cleared Apophis of impact was also one of the first hints that this is a loose, porous, low-density body, rather than a solid rock. The all-clear and the strangeness came from the same data. It is worth remembering, too, how this played out in public, because it is the opposite of a cover-up. The original impact scare unfolded over the Christmas season of 2004, with the probability ticking upward in the final days of December, and astronomers around the world trading urgent messages. The all-clear, when it came, was announced openly. Every step, the rising odds, the keyhole worry, the patient years of tracking, and finally the radar that closed the case, happened in the open scientific literature and in the press. Keep that in mind, because later in this story some people are going to tell you that the truth about Apophis is being hidden from you, and the entire documented history of this object says otherwise. This is why I can tell you so confidently that Apophis is not going to hit Earth, and why you should believe me. It is not blind faith in an agency, it is radar. When we bounce radio waves off an asteroid and time their return, we can measure not just where it is, but how fast it is moving toward or away from us, to a precision of a fraction of a millimetre per second. Combine that with more than 20 years of optical observations going all the way back to that night at Kitt Peak, and you get an orbit so well determined that the position of Apophis in 2029 is known better than the position of almost anything else of its kind. We are that good at the path. And that, right there, is the pivot this whole story turns on. We are masters of the orbit and strangers to the object. Think about how lopsided that is. We can tell you to the kilometre where a 340-metre rock will be 4 years from now, on a specific evening after travelling hundreds of millions of kilometres around the Sun. And yet, if you ask a much simpler question, what is it made of? How strong is it? What is hiding under its surface? The honest answer is that we mostly do not know. We have measured the dance with extraordinary accuracy. We have barely seen the dancer. You might think that is a strange gap to have, and you would be right, but it makes a kind of sense once you understand how we study these objects. An orbit reveals itself over time, through patient tracking, through the slow accumulation of position after position until the path is undeniable. The interior of an asteroid reveals nothing on its own. It just sits there, dark and silent, hundreds of millions of kilometres away, giving up almost no clue about what it is until you either fly a spacecraft to it or wait for something to disturb it. And until very recently, nothing was going to disturb Apophis. So we are left with this beautiful, frustrating imbalance, and it is the imbalance that makes the rest of this story possible. The precision of the orbit is exactly what lets the mystery of the interior stand out so sharply. Because we are so certain of where Apophis will be, we can aim spacecraft at it, plan observations down to the second, and turn the 2029 pass into the most anticipated natural experiment in the history of planetary science. The thing we cannot predict, the thing nobody can predict, is what the experiment will reveal about the one part of Apophis we have never been able to see. And the first real clue that the inside might be strange came not from any spacecraft, but from the simple, stubborn fact that when we finally got a good look at the shape of this rock, it looked like something it had no business looking like. Part 3. The shape that shouldn't be there. When the radar data from 2021 came back, the astronomers got more than just a refined orbit. They got a picture. A rough, grainy, hard-won picture of the actual shape of Apophis, the first time we had ever really seen the silhouette of this thing instead of just a moving dot. And the shape that emerged was not the simple potato or lumpy boulder that many people imagine when they hear the word asteroid. It was something stranger. It was elongated, stretched out along one axis, and it appeared to be divided, pinched in the middle, with two distinct lobes joined by a narrower waist. The scientists who described it reached for the same words again and again. It looks like a peanut. It looks like a dumbbell. It looks like two rocks stuck together. That description is not just a fun visual. It is a clue about the long history and the inner structure of this object, and it is the first place where the unease really begins, because a shape like that has a name in the world of asteroids. We call it a contact binary. The idea is exactly what it sounds like. Instead of one object, you have two separate bodies that long ago drifted together, touched and stayed touching, resting against each other and held together by the faint pull of their own mutual gravity. They are not fused, not welded into a single solid. They are leaning on one another, joined at a seam, like two boulders that rolled into each other and never rolled apart. How does something like that even come to exist? There are a few ways, and they all tell you something unsettling about how loosely the small bodies of our solar system are put together. In some cases, two separate asteroids drifting on similar orbits came together so gently, at speeds of maybe a few centimeters per second, walking pace or slower, that instead of shattering each other, they simply stuck. In other cases, a single rubble pile was spun faster and faster by sunlight, through a cousin of that Yarkovsky effect I mentioned, until it stretched, split, and then partially fell back together into a two-lobed shape. Either way, the lesson is the same. These objects are not solid sculptures carved from stone. They are assemblages, things that came together piece by piece, and are held in their current shape by almost nothing. And once you know to look for this shape, you start seeing it everywhere we send a spacecraft. The little asteroid Itokawa, the one the Hayabusa mission visited, is itself bilobed, a body that looks like a sea otter or a peanut, clearly made of two pieces resting together. When the European Rosetta mission arrived at Comet 67P, it found not a single dirty snowball, but two great lobes joined by a neck shaped a little like a rubber duck, and that neck became one of the most studied features of the entire mission, because scientists could see the stress fractures running through it. And out at the very edge of the solar system, when the New Horizons spacecraft flew past a distant object nicknamed Arakoth, it photographed the most perfect contact binary we have ever seen up close, two nearly round lobes pressed together like a cosmic snowman. We have a whole gallery of these things now, and the pattern that runs through all of them is the join, the waist, the neck, the place where two became one and never quite finished the merger. So Apophis is not an oddity. It is a member of a family we're coming to know well, and that is exactly what makes the prediction for 2029 possible to take seriously. We are not guessing about an unprecedented object. We are looking at a familiar kind of body, with a familiar weak point, and asking what a familiar kind of stress will do to it. The grainy radar pictures we have of Apophis are crude compared to the close-up portraits of Itokawa or Arakoth, more like a smudged shadow than a photograph, but they show the same essential thing: two lobes, a neck, a seam. This is not as rare as you might think, and that itself is part of why it matters. When we look across the population of near-Earth asteroids larger than about 200 meters, something close to 15% of them appear to have this bilobed, two-part shape. So Apophis is not unique. It belongs to a real and recognized family of objects that came together out of smaller pieces and now travel through space as loosely joined pairs. But knowing that a shape is common does not make it any less significant for what is coming, because the shape tells you where the body is weak. Now you might reasonably ask how on earth we can tell the shape of a rock only a few hundred meters across when it is tens of millions of kilometers away. Far too small and far too distant for any ordinary telescope to see as anything but a dot. The answer is one of the most elegant tricks in all of astronomy, and it is worth understanding because it is how we know what little we do know. We use radar. We point an enormous dish, like the one at Goldstone, at the asteroid, and we fire a powerful beam of radio waves across the gulf of space. Those waves strike the rock and bounce back, and we catch the faint return. Here is the clever part. The near side of the asteroid is slightly closer to us than the far side, so its return arrives a tiny fraction of a second sooner. And because the asteroid is spinning, one edge is rotating toward us and the other away, which shifts the frequency of the returning waves, the same way a passing siren changes pitch. By carefully reading the timing and the frequency of millions of these returning echoes, we can reconstruct a three-dimensional shape out of nothing but reflected radio. We are, in a real sense, feeling the shape of the rock with invisible fingers made of radio waves across 17 million kilometers of empty space. And what those invisible fingers traced was that pinched, two-lobed body with a neck in the middle. I keep coming back to the neck, and I want to tell you why, because this is the detail that turns a piece of trivia into the core of the story. In a body like this, the neck is the seam. It is the place where the two lobes meet, the narrowest part, the join. And anywhere there is a join, there is a weakness. Think of any object you have ever held that was made of two pieces stuck together, Where does it break, if it breaks? Not through the solid middle of either piece, it breaks at the seam. The neck of Apophis is its seam, and a seam is exactly the kind of feature that becomes dangerous the moment something starts pulling the two halves in different directions. This is the part that has lit up so much of the conversation online lately. There is a theory making the rounds, a viral thread that has spread across social media in recent days, pointing at exactly this shape and saying, in effect, look at it. It is two rocks held together by a thin neck, and something is wrong here. And I want to be fair to that instinct, because the instinct is not foolish. The people sharing that thread are looking at a real radar shape, noticing a real structural feature and drawing a conclusion that, at its core, is reasonable. A bilobed asteroid with a slender neck really is a more fragile thing than a single solid boulder. The drama some of them wrap around it runs ahead of the evidence, and we will get to exactly where it runs too far. But the underlying observation, that the shape itself implies a weak point, is sound. They have noticed something true. So hold this picture in your mind because we are going to need it. A stretched out rock, the size of a few football fields, made of two lobes leaning against each other, joined at a narrow neck that is the most fragile part of the whole structure. That is the body. And here is the thread I want you to carry forward into everything that comes next. That neck, that seam, that single weakest line through the whole asteroid is precisely the place that Earth's gravity is going to pull on the hardest in 2029. The shape is not just a curiosity, it is a map of where the experiment will press. And the shape is only half of the strangeness. Because when we looked not just at the outline of Apophis, but at how heavy it is for its size, and at the bizarre way it tumbles through space, the picture got stranger still, and it started to suggest that this is not really a rock at all. Part 4. A pile of rubble. Wearing the mask of a rock. Here is a question that sounds simple, and turns out to be one of the most important questions you can ask about any asteroid. How heavy is it for its size? Not how big, not how massive in absolute terms, but how tightly packed. Because the density of an object, how much matter it crams into a given volume, tells you what it is made of and, crucially, how it holds together. And when scientists worked out the density of Apophis, the number that came back was low. Suspiciously low, around 1.75 grams per cubic centimetre. For comparison, the solid stony rock you would find in a mountain on Earth runs closer to 3 grams per cubic centimetre, sometimes more. Apophis is barely more than half as dense as the rock it is supposedly made of. There's only one good way to explain that. Apophis cannot be solid. If it were a single intact boulder of stone, it would weigh far more than it does. The only way to get a body that large to be that light is for it to be full of empty space, riddled with gaps and voids and pockets of nothing. The estimates put the porosity, the fraction of the asteroid that is simply empty space, at around 40%. 40%. Picture that. Almost half of Apophis by volume may be nothing at all. It is not a rock, it is a loosely packed heap. This is what scientists mean when they use a phrase you may have heard, a rubble pile. The picture is not a single mountain hurtling through space. The picture is a slowly drifting swarm of gravel and boulders and dust and sand, thousands upon thousands of separate pieces, ranging from grains to chunks the size of houses, held together not by any glue, not by any solid bonds, but almost entirely by their own faint mutual gravity. A rubble pile asteroid is less like a stone and more like a pile of sand that is barely holding its shape in the gentlest possible grip. You could, in principle, push your hand into it. The whole thing is held together by a force so weak that a strong enough tug from outside could rearrange it. We are not guessing at this in a vacuum. We have been to objects like this and seen them up close. When the Japanese Hayabusa spacecraft visited a small asteroid called Itokawa, it found exactly this. A rubble pile, a jumble of boulders and gravel with almost no solid core, so loosely bound it was barely an object at all. Apophis closely resembles Itokawa in the ways we can measure, in its likely composition, a stony type loaded with the minerals olivine and pyroxene, the same family as a common class of meteorites that fall to Earth. When the OSIRIS-REx mission visited the asteroid Bennu, it found a surface so loosely packed that when the spacecraft reached down to grab a sample, it sank into the ground like the surface was a ball pit and very nearly buried itself. The scientists running that mission later said that if you stepped onto Bennu, you might sink in as if stepping into a pit of plastic balls, and that if the spacecraft had not fired its thrusters to back away, it could have kept sinking. These objects are not what our imaginations tell us asteroids are. They are flying rubble. Where does a rubble pile come from? The leading idea is almost violent in its simplicity. Long ago, there was a larger parent body, a more solid asteroid, and at some point it was smashed, shattered in a collision with another object into thousands or millions of fragments. But the fragments did not all fly apart forever. The gravity of the debris, weak as it was, slowly pulled a portion of it back together over thousands of years, and what reassembled was not a solid rock anymore but a heap, a gravitational clump of the pieces, with all the gaps and voids and loose contacts that come from a pile that was poured rather than carved. Apophis, in this picture, is the reassembled ghost of something that was broken long ago. The 40% of it that is empty space is the memory of that shattering, the gaps between fragments that never closed. And the force holding it together is shockingly weak. We are not talking about the chemical bonds that hold a boulder together. We are talking mostly about gravity, plus a faint stickiness between grains, the same kind of subtle surface attraction that makes flour clump or lets dust cling to a surface. For a body the size of Apophis, that adds up to a grip you could measure but barely. This is why the encounter in 2029 is such a live question. You're taking an object held together by a whisper and exposing it to the pull of an entire planet. With a solid rock, you would not even ask the question. The rock would simply pass by unchanged. With a rubble pile, the question is wide open. The strange tumble fits this picture perfectly, and it is worth understanding why a tumble even persists. Most objects, over long enough time, are supposed to settle into a simple spin. Internal friction, the tiny flexing and rubbing inside a body as it wobbles, slowly bleeds away the wobble and leaves a clean rotation, the way a spinning top eventually settles or falls. For a body to still be tumbling, one of two things has to be true. Either something disturbed it relatively recently, or its internal structure is so stiff or so strangely arranged that the wobble has not damped out over the age of the solar system. Both possibilities point straight at the interior. A tumble is not just motion. It is a record, a slow clock that has been keeping time on the inside of Apophis for ages, and reading that clock is one of the only ways we have to ask what the inside is doing. This is the concept that the people arguing online have stumbled onto, even if the exact numbers in their thread are not ones I would stake anything on. The way a body distributes its mass, what physicists call its moment of inertia, completely governs how it tumbles. Change the arrangement of mass inside, make one lobe denser than the other, hollow out a region here, pack it tight there, and the tumble changes in response. So a measured tumble that refuses to match the simplest model is not a paradox, and it is not a sign of anything beyond physics. It is the interior talking. It is the only voice the inside of Apophis has, and it has been speaking the whole time, if only we knew how to listen. And then there is the spin, which is where it gets genuinely eerie. Most objects in space, left alone, settle into a simple, stable rotation. They spin around one axis, smoothly, like a well-thrown football spiralling through the air or a planet turning on its pole. Apophis does not do that. Apophis tumbles. It is in what scientists call a non-principal axis rotation, a state where the object is essentially rotating around more than one axis at the same time, so that it wobbles and rolls as it spins, never settling, never repeating cleanly. The strongest rhythm in its tumble takes about 30.5 hours, but layered on top of that is a second, slower wobble that takes something closer to 263 hours. Picture a football thrown by someone who has no idea what they are doing, end over end and sideways at once, never finding a clean spiral. That is how the god of chaos moves through space. It is not spinning, it is tumbling. This is exactly the feature that the viral theory online has seized on, and again, I want to walk through it honestly, because there is a real signal buried inside the noise. The thread going around makes a specific dramatic claim. It says that if you take the shape of Apophis and assume it is a simple, rigid, uniform solid, then the physics says it should tumble with a certain ratio between its spin and its slower wobble, and that ratio should be one number, while the ratio we actually measure is a very different number, off by roughly a factor of 2. And the conclusion the thread draws is bold. It says the mismatch means something inside Apophis is flexing. that the body is not behaving like a solid because it is not solid, that it is shifting and giving on the inside. Now, I have to be straight with you about the specific figures in that thread, because intellectual honesty is the whole point of this channel. The exact numbers being passed around, the precise ratios, I cannot verify, and you should treat them as illustrative rather than as hard-measured fact. They have the feel of figures that got sharper and more confident every time they were retyped. But, and this is the important but, the spirit of the claim is pointing at something real. Here is the genuine science underneath it. The way a tumbling body rotates is exquisitely sensitive to how its mass is distributed on the inside. A uniform solid tumbles one way. A lumpy, uneven body with denser regions here and looser, emptier regions there, tumbles differently. So when a real asteroid's tumble does not match what you would predict for a smooth, uniform rock, that is not a sign of anything supernatural. It is a fingerprint. It is the interior leaving its signature in the motion. A weird tumble is exactly what you would expect from a lumpy, heterogeneous pile of rubble with its mass spread unevenly inside. Do you see what that means? The spin is a window. It is one of the only windows we have into the part of Apophis we cannot see. The way this thing rolls and wobbles through space is being dictated right now by the arrangement of mass far inside it, the very thing no telescope can show us directly. We cannot cut Apophis open, but we can watch how it moves, and its movement is quietly reporting on its hidden insides every single second. And that brings us right back to the thread that ties this entire story together. If the tumble of Apophis is shaped by its unseen interior, then the single most powerful thing we could possibly do to read that interior would be to give the asteroid a hard shove and watch how its tumble changes. Measure the spin carefully before, apply a force, and measure the spin carefully after. The difference would tell us about the inside in a way nothing else could. And that is not a hypothetical. That is precisely what is going to happen in 2029, except the shove is not going to come from us. It is going to come from the Earth itself. So let's talk about the experiment and about exactly what happens when a planet reaches out and squeezes a ghost. Part 5. When a planet squeezes a ghost. To understand what Earth is going to do to Apophis, you have to understand a force you already know intimately, even if you have never named it. It is the same force that raises the ocean into a bulge twice a day and pulls it back down again. It is the force that has slowly locked the moon so that it shows us only one face. It is called the tidal force, and it is not really a separate force at all. It is just gravity, behaving unevenly. Gravity gets weaker with distance. So when a large body like the Earth pulls on an extended object like an asteroid, the near side of that object gets pulled a little harder than the far side, simply because the near side is closer. The whole object feels a stretch, a difference in pull from one end to the other. On the ocean, that difference lifts the tides. On a loosely bound rubble pile passing 31,000 kilometers overhead, that difference becomes something far more interesting. Here is the scene then, as Apophis comes in. It falls toward Earth along its precisely known path, and as it does, it enters the region where our planet's gravity is strong, and more importantly, steeply changing. The side of the asteroid facing Earth feels a noticeably stronger tug than the side facing away. The body is stretched along the line pointing at the Earth, and at the same time, because it is tumbling, different parts of it swing into and out of that line of maximum stress, over and over, during the hours of closest approach. The Earth does not just pull on Apophis once, it works it, like hands kneading a lump of dough, twisting and stretching and releasing as the asteroid rolls past. For a rubble pile held together by the faintest possible grip, this is the most violent thing that has happened to it in a very, very long time. Now, there is a crucial line in space that decides whether this kind of squeezing tears a body apart or merely disturbs it, and I want to introduce it because it is the single best reason not to panic, and also the reason the question stays genuinely open. It is called the Roche limit. The Roche limit is the distance from a planet inside which the tidal stretching becomes so strong that a body held together only by its own gravity would be pulled apart. Cross that line, and a strengthless rubble pile cannot hold itself together. Stay outside it, and it can. For the Earth, and for a low-density body like Apophis, that limit sits somewhere around 18,000 kilometers from the planet's center, and here is the number that matters. Apophis, at its closest, will pass roughly 38,000 kilometers from the center of the Earth. That is comfortably outside the Roche limit. It is not even close to the line where pure gravity would lose its grip. This is the underlying reason the models do not predict that Apophis simply disintegrates. It is passing through the zone where it gets stressed and disturbed, not the zone where it gets dismantled. So why is there any suspense at all if it stays safely outside that line? Because the Roche limit describes the threshold for total disruption of a body held together by gravity alone, and reality is messier than that clean cutoff. Real rubble piles have a little extra cohesion, that faint stickiness between grains which helps them resist. But they also have weak points, like our neck, where the local strength can be far lower than the average. The Roche limit tells you the body will not be torn to pieces. It does not tell you whether a lobe will shift, whether the surface will avalanche, whether the spin will flip hard or gently, or whether the weakest seam will give a little. Those outcomes live in the messy middle ground between nothing and disruption, and that messy middle is exactly where the interior we cannot see gets to cast the deciding vote. This is where the modelling becomes its own kind of art. To predict what happens, scientists cannot just treat Apophis as a single object in an equation. They have to build it virtually out of its pieces. The most detailed simulations construct a model of Apophis from thousands of individual particles, in some studies around 4,600 of them, each one a stand-in for a chunk of the rubble pile, and then they let those particles interact with one another and with the Earth's gravity through the whole encounter, collision by collision, contact by contact. They run it many times, changing the assumptions each time. What if the two lobes have the same density? What if the head is up to 70% denser than the body? What if the cohesion is a little higher or a little lower? Each run is a different possible Apophis, and each one responds to the flyby in its own way. The spread of those responses is the range of futures I keep coming back to, and the reason no single answer can be promised. Let me walk you through the hours themselves, because the encounter is not an instant. It is a slow, building event that plays out over most of a day, and knowing the shape of it helps you feel the suspense the way the scientists do. In the hours before closest approach, Apophis is still far enough out that the Earth's pull is gentle, and even across its body. It is tumbling along as it has for ages, undisturbed, and the spacecraft riding with it are taking their careful baseline measurements, recording the spin, the shape, the surface, the exact starting state. This is the calm before. Then, as the asteroid sweeps inward, the difference in pull between its near side and its far side grows, slowly at first and then faster, the stretching force climbing as the distance shrinks. The body that has been left alone for so long begins, for the first time in perhaps millions of years, to feel itself being pulled unevenly. At the moment of closest approach, that evening over the Atlantic, the stress reaches its peak. This is the instant everything has been building toward. The few minutes when the Earth's grip is tightest and the tidal stretching is strongest. When whatever is going to shift, shifts. If the neck is going to relieve its compression and let a lobe roll, this is when. If the surface is going to slide, this is when the avalanches begin. If the spin is going to be wrenched onto a new rate, this is the wrench. And then, almost as soon as it peaked, it begins to ease. Apophis is moving fast and it does not linger. Within hours it is receding, the stress falling away as quickly as it rose, and the asteroid is left to settle into whatever new state the encounter has given it. The whole violent, transformative event, the only one of its kind we will ever have a front row seat to, is essentially over in an afternoon. And here is the headline measurement, the one number that everything comes down to, the spin. Before the encounter, we measure exactly how Apophis tumbles, its rate, its axis, its wobble. After the encounter, we measure it again. The difference between those two measurements is the readout of the experiment, the answer the asteroid gives. If the spin has barely changed, that tells us the interior is relatively strong, well-bound, resistant, more like a coherent body than a loose heap. If the spin has changed dramatically, if the rate has nearly doubled or nearly halved, and the axis has swung to point somewhere new, that tells us the interior is weak, loose, easily moved, a true rubble pile that the Earth was able to grab and reshape. The spin is the voice of the interior, and the encounter is the moment we finally get to hear it speak clearly, because we are the ones who provoked it. Picture the two extremes, so you can feel what is at stake in that measurement. In the gentle version, the spacecraft watch Apophis pass through the encounter almost serenely. The spin shifts a little, a few small landslides perhaps stir the surface, and the asteroid comes out the other side looking much as it went in. We learn that it is stronger than its low density suggested, and that itself is a valuable surprise. In the dramatic version, the spacecraft watch the asteroid's tumble visibly change over the hours, watch fresh material slide and expose brighter ground beneath the weathered skin, watch the subtle repositioning of one lobe against the other at the neck, and they record a body that has been measurably reshaped by its encounter with our world. We learn that these objects are even more fragile and more alive than we thought. Both outcomes are scientific gold. Both rewrite a piece of what we know, and which one we get is a question only Apophis can answer. In the one afternoon it has to answer it. Within that range, the mechanism that most excites the scientists is the surface response, because that is the part we have the best chance of actually seeing. When the spin rate changes and the tidal stress ripples through the body, the balance of forces holding loose material in place on the surface shifts. On a body with gravity this weak, that loose material is barely held down to begin with. A small nudge can set it moving. Grains and pebbles and boulders can begin to slide, to creep downslope, to avalanche in slow motion across the surface. Scientists call this resurfacing, and it matters far more than it might sound, because of what lies underneath. The outer skin of any asteroid is slowly altered over millions of years by the constant bombardment of solar radiation and micrometeorites, a process called space weathering that darkens and reddens and changes the surface. The material just below that skin is pristine, unaltered, a sample of what the asteroid is really made of. If the 2029 encounter triggers landslides that strip away the weathered skin and expose fresh material beneath, then for the first time we would get to see the true, unweathered face of a near-Earth asteroid, revealed not by a drill or a sample, but by the hand of our own planet. And all of this would unfold in a window of just a few hours, centered on that moment of closest approach over the Atlantic. The stretching builds as Apophis comes in, peaks as it sweeps past at its nearest point, and eases as it recedes. The spin change, the neck stress, the avalanches, if they happen in that brief window, like a single long breath taken by the asteroid as the Earth squeezes and releases. We will have spacecraft positioned to watch that breath in detail, and we will be comparing the before and the after with everything we have. But whether that breath is a barely perceptible sigh, or a visible surface-altering convulsion, nobody can tell you in advance, because the answer is written in the one chapter of Apophis we have never been allowed to read. The encounter is the moment the book finally falls open, and the wilder the interior turns out to be, the more dramatic the page. So what do the scientists actually expect to happen? This is where careful modelling comes in, and several independent teams have built detailed simulations of this encounter, constructing virtual versions of Apophis out of thousands of individual particles to mimic a rubble pile, and then running the Earth flyby to see what the body does. And the headline result, the thing nearly all of them agree on, is this: the spin state of Apophis will change, and it will change enough that we can measure it. The asteroid will most likely remain a tumbler, but the speed of its tumble could shift dramatically. Depending on the exact details of its interior, its effective spin rate could roughly halve, or it could roughly double. The direction its rotation axis points in space, what we call the pole, is expected to shift as well. In a single afternoon, Earth's gravity could meaningfully rewrite the way this asteroid has been turning for ages. Now I have to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of place where excitement outruns the evidence, and I promised you I would not do that. The actual physical deformation of the body, the squashing and stretching of its shape, is predicted by most models to be tiny. We're talking about movement on the scale of centimetres, or even less, and much of that deformation is expected to be elastic, which means it springs back, the way a stress ball returns to its shape after you stop squeezing. Apophis is not, by the mainstream prediction, going to be visibly crushed or bent. If you were floating beside it, you would not see it deform like clay. The changes to its surface and shape are subtle. So let me say it plainly. The most likely outcome of this encounter is not destruction. It is a measurable change in spin and a set of small, subtle disturbances. But, and here is where it gets interesting again, those disturbances are not evenly spread across the body. Remember the neck. Remember that seam between the two lobes that I asked you to hold on to. When the models look at where the stress concentrates during the flyby, the answer comes back the same way nearly every time. The stress piles up at the neck. The waist between the two lobes is where the tidal forces do their most concentrated work, where the pulling is most likely to relieve the compression that normally holds the two halves snugly together. And in some of the models, that relief is enough to allow a subtle but real shift, a slight rolling or repositioning of one lobe against the other, as the grip that held them locked is briefly loosened by the Earth. And there is more. The same tidal stress and the same change in spin could be enough to do something on the surface that we would genuinely love to see. It could trigger landslides. On a body held together this weakly, you do not need much to set loose material moving. A small change in the spin rate alters the delicate balance between gravity pulling material down and centrifugal motion flinging it out. A bit of tidal shaking can act like a seismic tremor through the pile, and the result could be avalanches, slumps, slides of regolith, the loose surface material cascading across the asteroid and exposing fresh ground underneath. Material that has been buried and shielded from space for who knows how long. Apophis could, in the span of a few hours, partially resurface itself in front of us. I know that the modelers describe these effects with restrained words, small, limited, possibly negligible, and on the scale of a Hollywood disaster, yes, this is modest. There is no explosion. There is no shattering. But I want you to step back and feel the actual weight of what I just described, because the restraint of the language hides something historic. We are talking about watching a planet reach out and change the spin of an asteroid, shift its pole, loosen the seam between its two halves, and possibly trigger landslides that expose fresh material, all in real time, all in a single pass. We have never seen anything like this happen, not once. In the entire history of human science, we have never had a front-row seat to a planet physically reworking another world. Modest on the cosmic scale is still unprecedented on the human one. And now we arrive at the real engine of the suspense, the thing that actually keeps the scientists up at night, and it is not any single prediction. It is the spread of the predictions. Because here is the uncomfortable truth at the center of all this modelling. Every one of those simulations had to make an assumption about the one thing we do not know, the interior. How is the mass arranged inside? How strong is the cohesion holding the rubble together? Is the neck packed tight or held loose? Are the two lobes the same density or wildly different? The modelers do not know, so they run a whole range of possibilities, and the range of outcomes that comes out the other side is wide. A stronger, more tightly bound interior gives you the gentle version, a small spin change and almost nothing else. A weaker, looser, more uneven interior gives you the dramatic version, a large spin flip, real shifting at the neck, visible landslides, a face we have never seen. Do you understand what that means? It means the models cannot tell us what will happen. They can only tell us the menu of what could happen, and the diner who chooses from that menu is Apophis itself, and it will not show us its choice until the experiment is already underway. The asteroid is going to answer a question we have been asking for 20 years, the question of what it is truly made of on the inside, and it is going to answer it by how it behaves when the Earth squeezes it. A big, surprising change tells us the interior is weak and strange. A barely detectable one tells us it is stronger than it looks. Either way, the moment of the flyby is the moment the black box finally cracks open a sliver, and we read the answer in the spin, and the slides, and the shifting neck. That is the experiment. That is what nobody can predict. And it is also the reason a much wilder idea has taken hold in some corners of the internet. An idea that the gentle, centimetre-scale models firmly reject, but that I would be doing you a disservice not to take seriously and walk through carefully. The idea that in 2029 the god of chaos might not just shift, it might break. Part 6. The scenario. Everyone is whispering about. Let me lay out the dramatic version for you, the one circulating online right now, and let me lay it out at full strength, the way its believers tell it, because it deserves a fair hearing before we test it. It goes like this. Apophis is two lobes joined by a thin neck. That neck has some critical width, some threshold of thickness, and the people pushing this idea put that threshold at somewhere around 30 to 35 meters. Above that width, the neck is strong enough to survive the tidal stress of the flyby and hold the body together. But below that width, if the neck is thinner than the threshold, the stretching force of the Earth could overwhelm it, and the neck could fail, the two lobes could separate. And then, The theory continues. Things get truly strange, because the moment Apophis stops being one object and becomes two, the two pieces no longer follow the same path. They have slightly different shapes, slightly different masses, and they would drift apart onto slightly different orbits. And the most provocative claim of all is this. One of those separated pieces might thread its way through one of those gravitational keyholes, the narrow doorways to a future impact that the combined body would have sailed safely past. I want to give that scenario its due, because it is not built on nonsense. The instinct behind it is grounded in real physics, and I would be lying to you if I said otherwise. Necks really are stress concentrators. That is true in engineering, in bones, in welds, in candy bars, and in asteroids. The thinnest part of a joined structure really is where failure tends to begin, and contact binary asteroids really can come apart under tidal stress. We have strong reason to believe that some of the asteroids we see split into pairs, and some of the strange shapes we observe are the result of exactly this kind of tidal disruption during close planetary encounters in the past. So the idea that a close pass could stress a bilobed rubble pile at its weakest point, and that in principle such a body could be pulled apart, is not a fantasy. It is a real category of event that really happens in our solar system. The believers are not making up the mechanism. They are taking a real mechanism and turning the dial to the maximum. Take that critical neck width they cite, the threshold of around 30 to 35 meters, above which the neck supposedly holds and below which it fails. There is a kernel of real physics in that idea, and it is worth being precise about. The strength of a neck, its ability to resist being pulled apart, does scale with how much material spans it, roughly with the area of its cross-section. A thicker neck has more grains in contact, more gravity pulling the lobes together, more cohesion across the join, and so it can resist more stress. A thinner neck has less of everything and gives way more easily. So the concept that there is some width below which a given tidal stress wins is not nonsense. The problem is the confidence in the specific number. We do not actually know the width of Apophis's neck with anything like the precision needed to say it sits on one side of a sharp line, and we do not know its cohesion, and the threshold itself depends on assumptions about both. A real principle has been turned into a precise-sounding cutoff that the data simply does not support. And here is something the dramatic version almost never mentions, which deflates it considerably even if you grant the breakup. If Apophis somehow did separate at the neck, it would not happen like an explosion. There would be no blast, no scattering of shrapnel. The two lobes, having been held together by the faintest of grips, would simply drift apart at a speed of maybe a few centimeters per second, walking pace at the absolute most, more likely far slower. They would separate the way two boats drift apart on a still lake when you stop holding them together. The pieces would continue along almost exactly the same orbit, side by side, parting by meters over hours. For one of those gently drifting pieces to then thread a gravitational keyhole less than a kilometer wide, a keyhole the combined body was already measured to miss by a wide margin, the separation would have to nudge it by just the right amount in just the right direction, an astronomically specific coincidence stacked on top of an event the models already say will not occur. You can see how a chain of unlikely things, each one multiplied by the next, drives the real probability down toward the vanishing point. The scenario is not impossible in the way that a square circle is impossible. It is improbable in the way that flipping a coin and having it land on its edge twice is improbable. So the honest verdict on the breakup story is not a flat no. It is a grounded, quantified, very unlikely, and here is exactly why. And that is a more satisfying answer than either the doom version or the dismissive version, because it respects the real physics while refusing to inflate it. And the keyhole twist, I will admit, is genuinely clever and genuinely unsettling as a piece of reasoning. The whole reason we relaxed about Apophis is that we measured the combined body's path with such precision that we know it misses every keyhole. But that certainty is a certainty about one object on one trajectory. If the object becomes two objects on two trajectories, then strictly speaking, the old all clear was calculated for a body that no longer exists. You would have to recompute everything for each fragment. It is the kind of idea that, once it is in your head, is very hard to shake. What if the thing we cleared splits into pieces we never cleared? So now let me do what this channel exists to do, which is to take that electric, frightening idea and hold it up against the actual science. calmly, and tell you where it stands. And here is where it stands. The detailed modelling, the same simulations I described a moment ago, the ones built particle by particle to represent a rubble pile, do not predict that Apophis breaks apart. They predict overwhelmingly that the deformation is on the scale of centimetres, and that it is elastic, reversible, a flex and a settling rather than a rupture. The stress concentrates at the neck, yes, and the neck may shift, the lobes may roll slightly against each other, but separation, the clean breaking of the body into two free pieces, is not what the physics says happens at this distance, with this geometry, for a body of this size. Earth's pull at 31,000 kilometres is firm, but it is not the kind of grip that tears a 300-metre body in half. The breakup scenario is the far, unlikely tail of the range of possibilities, not the centre of it. And the keyhole worry sits on top of a breakup that the models do not expect in the first place, which makes it a small possibility, resting on an unlikely one. On top of all that, the impact has been ruled out for 100 years for the body as we know it, and nothing in the credible modelling suggests that is about to change. But here is why the scientists still cannot fully exhale, and why I am not going to stand here and tell you this is a complete nothing. Because every reassuring word I just said rests on those models, and those models rest on assumptions about the interior, the very thing we have admitted we cannot see. When a scientist says breakup is not expected, what they honestly mean is breakup is not expected if the interior is roughly as strong as we think it probably is. But we do not know that it is. There is also that one genuine science-based sliver of residual uncertainty I mentioned earlier. The small chance that the asteroid's exact path could be nudged, even slightly, by the gravity of some other small object we have not yet detected before 2029 arrives. That is not a conspiracy. That is just the honest edge of our knowledge. The reassurance is strong, it is not absolute, and that gap between strong and absolute is exactly where the nervousness lives. And the gap is not just philosophical hand-waving, because we know that close encounters really do reshape these bodies. When astronomers survey the asteroid population, they find pairs, two separate asteroids travelling on almost identical orbits around the Sun, clearly born from a single parent that came apart. They find asteroids that appear to have been spun up and partially shed material, and there is a growing body of evidence that the surfaces of many near-Earth asteroids have been refreshed, their weathered skins disturbed, by past close passes to Earth and other planets. In other words, the gentle version of what we expect from Apophis, the shaking and the resurfacing, is not just a model. It is something the solar system has clearly done to other bodies, over and over. The question is only one of degree, and degree is set by the interior. The same encounter that would barely ruffle a strong, well-bound body could meaningfully rearrange a weak, loosely packed one. Apophis is the test case precisely because we do not know which kind it is. There is also that one genuinely science-based source of lingering uncertainty I want to give its full due, because it is the kind of honest detail that gets lost between the doomsayers and the dismissers. Researchers have pointed out that between now and 2029, Apophis's path could, in principle, be nudged ever so slightly by a close gravitational pass with another asteroid we have not yet detected, a small dark object crossing its path. The effect would be minuscule, and it does not resurrect the impact scenario, but it is a reminder that every confident statement about exactly where Apophis will be, and therefore exactly how hard the Earth will squeeze it, rests on the assumption that we have accounted for everything out there. We almost certainly have. But almost is not the same as certainly, and good scientists are careful to say so. That is not fear-mongering. That is the honest texture of a real prediction about a real object in a crowded solar system. Stack it all together and you see why the mood is what it is. We have a body whose interior is unknown, passing outside the line of certain destruction, but inside the range where strange things can happen, with a known weak point that the encounter will stress hardest, and a small but real residual uncertainty riding on top. None of that adds up to catastrophe. All of it adds up to suspense. The scientists are not bracing for disaster, they are bracing for surprise, which in a field built on prediction is its own kind of uncomfortable thrill. There is a memory that hangs over all of this, and it is worth invoking, because it is the closest thing we have ever seen to the dramatic scenario. In 1994, a comet called Shoemaker-Levy 9 did exactly what the believers fear Apophis might do. It passed too close to Jupiter, and Jupiter's enormous tidal forces tore it apart, ripping the comet into a string of more than 20 fragments that astronomers described as a string of pearls strung across the sky. And then, on the next pass, those fragments slammed into Jupiter one after another, leaving scars in the giant planet's clouds larger than the Earth. We watched it happen. It is the proof that a body can be pulled apart by a planet's gravity and broken into a chain of pieces. It is not a fantasy. It happened. It is worth lingering on that event for a moment because of how vividly it showed us what tidal forces can do and how the whole world got to witness it. The comet had actually been torn apart on an earlier close pass to Jupiter before anyone discovered it. By the time astronomers found it in 1993, it was already a broken thing, more than 20 fragments strung out in a line, and when the Hubble Space Telescope turned to look, it sent back an image that became famous overnight. A glittering row of icy chunks marching across the dark, each one trailing its own little haze, the string of pearls. For more than a year, the world knew those pieces were going to fall into Jupiter, and on a series of days in July of 1994, they did, one after another, slamming into the giant planet at enormous speed. Each impact blew up a dark plume of debris, and the bruises they left in Jupiter's clouds were so large that some of them were wider than the entire Earth, and they lingered for months, visible in backyard telescopes. That week changed how our species thinks about the sky. It was the first time we had ever predicted a collision between two bodies in the solar system, and then watched it unfold on schedule. It proved, in front of everyone, that these impacts are not ancient history frozen in old craters, but a process that is still happening, still shaping worlds, right now. It is a large part of the reason that the funding and the will to hunt for dangerous asteroids gathered real momentum in the years that followed. A comet tore apart at a planet and hammered it, with pieces larger than continents, and humanity, watching, finally took the threat from the sky seriously. The string of pearls is burned into the memory of everyone who studies these things, and it is exactly the image that flickers in the back of the mind when someone says the words tidal forces and bay-lobed asteroid in the same breath. So when the online theories reach for that picture and apply it to Apophis, I understand the instinct completely. It is the most spectacular thing tidal forces have ever done in front of us. But the memory has to be matched to the reality. Shoemaker-Levy 9 was a fragile comet that got captured by the most powerful gravity well among the planets and was shredded over repeated close passes. Apophis is a stony rubble pile making one swift single pass by a far smaller world, outside the line where pure tides could dismantle it. The pearls are a warning about what is possible at the extreme. They are not a forecast for this encounter, but I invoke Shoemaker-Levy 9 so that I can also tell you why Apophis is not it. Jupiter is a monster, more than 300 times the mass of the Earth, with a tidal grip our planet cannot begin to match. That comet did not just pass Jupiter, it was captured, dragged in on a tightening loop and shredded over time. Apophis is making a single fast pass by a far smaller world and continuing on its way. The Earth is not Jupiter, and a brush is not a plunge. The image of the string of pearls is haunting, and it is real, but it belongs to a far more violent encounter than the one coming in 2029. So the mature way to hold all of this, the honest way, is not to expect catastrophe, and it is not to dismiss the question either. It is to sit in the suspense. The drama of Apophis is not that it will break apart. The drama is that we genuinely have to wait and watch to find out what it does, because the only instrument precise enough to settle the argument is the encounter itself, which raises the most practical question of all. When that one and only experiment runs, who exactly is going to be watching, and how closely? Because the answer to that is the difference between learning everything and learning almost nothing. Part 7. The Machines and the 2 Billion Eyes. For most of the close encounters in the history of our solar system, no one was watching. Asteroids have been swinging past planets and being reshaped by their gravity for billions of years, and every one of those events happened in the dark, unrecorded, unmeasured, gone before anyone existed to see it. What makes 2029 different? What truly makes it a turning point is that for the first time we are going to be there, not just glancing up, but watching with everything we have, machines and telescopes and human eyes, all trained on the same rock at the same moment. And there are two spacecraft in particular that turn this from a spectacle into an experiment. The first has one of the great second acts in the history of space exploration. You may remember the mission called OSIRIS-REx. The NASA spacecraft that flew to the asteroid Bennu reached down, grabbed a sample of its surface, and sent that sample home to Earth in a capsule that landed in the Utah desert. That could have been the end of the story. The spacecraft had done its job, but it still had fuel, and it was still healthy, and it was still flying. So NASA gave it a new name and a new destiny. It is now called OSIRIS-APEX, and its entire reason for living is to chase down Apophis, the spacecraft that already proved it could rendezvous with one rubble pile and touch its surface is now racing across the solar system to meet the most famous asteroid of them all. The choreography of how it arrives is almost poetic, and it tells you how precisely we can predict the orbit we spent 20 years measuring. OSIRIS-APEX is timed to reach Apophis right around the moment of the close approach in April of 2029. It actually passes by just about an hour behind the asteroid as the whole system sweeps past the Earth, and then it uses the Earth's own gravity as a slingshot, an assist that lets it catch up to Apophis a little more than a week later. And then it settles in. For roughly 18 months, this spacecraft will fly alongside the god of chaos, mapping its surface with cameras and spectrometers, and a laser altimeter that measures the shape of the terrain down to fine detail, reading the chemistry of the rock, watching how it turns. But the single most remarkable thing OSIRIS-APEX is going to do is something it learned at Bennu, and it is the closest we'll come to physically reaching inside the asteroid. The spacecraft is going to descend toward the surface, dropping down to within about 5 meters of the ground, close enough to almost touch it, and then it is going to fire its thrusters downward, blasting the surface with its own engines, deliberately stirring up and blowing away the top layer of loose material. The goal is to peel back the surface, to expose the fresher material hidden just underneath, the stuff that has been shielded from the harsh weathering of space, and to study what gets revealed. Think about what that means in the context of everything we have discussed. We have spent this whole story talking about how the interior of Apophis is a black box we cannot see into. OSIRIS-APEX is going to fly down and blow the lid off a little corner of it on purpose. It helps to remember what this spacecraft has already proven it can do because it changes how much you should trust the plan. As OSIRIS-REx, it spent years at the asteroid Bennu, mapping every boulder, choosing a landing site, and then performing one of the most delicate maneuvers ever attempted, reaching down and tapping the surface to collect a sample. That sample, a few hundred grams of pristine asteroid, rode home in a capsule and parachuted into the Utah desert in the autumn of 2023. The first American asteroid sample ever returned. This is not an untested concept. The same proven spacecraft, with the same instruments and the same team that already touched one rubble pile and brought a piece of it home, is the one being sent to Apophis. When they say it can fly within a few meters of the surface and stir the regolith, they are describing a thing this exact spacecraft has essentially already done once. The way it arrives is dictated by the very orbit we spent 20 years measuring, and the choreography is worth picturing. OSIRIS-APEX cannot simply park next to Apophis as it screams past the Earth, because matching that speed and that geometry instantly is not possible. So instead, it is timed to swoop through the encounter close behind the asteroid, trailing it by only about an hour as the whole arrangement passes the Earth, and then it uses our planet's gravity as a slingshot, the same kind of free boost that has flung spacecraft across the solar system for decades, to bend and accelerate its own path so that it catches up to Apophis a little more than a week later. From there it falls into formation and stays for roughly a year and a half, our patient witness riding alongside the god of chaos through all the quiet months after the squeeze, watching how the disturbed body settles. The second mission completes the picture, and it carries its own lineage. Europe's contribution, the Ramses mission, draws on hardware and design lessons from an earlier European mission to a different asteroid system. So like OSIRIS-APEX, it is not starting from a blank page. Its job is the before. By arriving around February of 2029, roughly 2 months ahead of the encounter, it can take careful, unhurried measurements of Apophis in its undisturbed state, the baseline, and then ride along to record the after. And it brings, among other instruments, that Japanese-built thermal camera that reads the temperature across the surface, which tells us how the surface holds and sheds heat, which in turn reveals how loose or packed, how fine or bouldered that surface really is. Remember the Yarkovsky effect, the faint heat-driven push that helped clear Apophis of impact. The same thermal measurements that map the surface also sharpen our understanding of that push, tightening the orbit even further. Everything in this story loops back on itself. The heat reveals the surface refines the orbit lets us aim the spacecraft, and the spacecraft reads the interior. And it will not be alone. The European Space Agency, working together with the Japanese Space Agency, is building a second mission, called Ramses. And Ramses has a different and equally crucial job. It is designed to launch around 2028, and to arrive at Apophis in February of 2029, about 2 months before the close approach. That timing is the entire point. Ramses is meant to get there early, so that it can study Apophis carefully before the Earth touches it. It will measure the asteroid's shape, its spin, its surface, its exact state, and establish a detailed baseline of what Apophis is like in its undisturbed condition. Then it will ride along through the encounter and watch what changes. Among its instruments is a thermal infrared imager, contributed by the Japanese side, that reads the temperature across the asteroid's surface and helps reveal the nature of that surface and how heat moves through it. Now think about why that before and after design matters so much, because this is the part that elevates the whole endeavour from sightseeing to science. An experiment is only meaningful if you measure the starting condition. If all you have is a picture of Apophis after the flyby, you can describe it, but you cannot know what changed, because you never recorded what it was before. By having Ramses on station 2 months early, taking careful measurements of the spin, the shape, the surface, we create the before. Then the Earth applies its force. Then we measure the after with both spacecraft in detail. The difference between those two measurements is the answer to the 20-year-old question. The difference is the readout of the experiment. We are not just going to watch Apophis get squeezed. We are going to measure exactly how it responds, and from that response finally start to read what it is made of inside. And then there is the last set of instruments, the most numerous and in some ways the most important, and they do not cost a single dollar to build. They are human eyes, roughly 2 billion of them. Because while the spacecraft do the precise science, the people of Earth, across Europe and Africa and Western Asia, will be able to step outside on that April evening and see Apophis with the naked eye, a moving point of light brighter than the stars of the Big Dipper, crossing the sky over the course of a single night. For once in the long, strange history of our relationship with the objects that share our solar system, the event will not be something the public reads about in a press release the next morning. It will be something they witness directly, in the moment, looking up with their own eyes at a piece of the early solar system passing beneath our satellites. And behind the naked eye crowds and the 2 spacecraft, there will be a third tier of watchers, the professional observatories of Earth, turning their instruments on Apophis as it passes. Powerful radar dishes will hammer it with radio waves to read its shape and spin at the moment of closest approach. The same technique that first revealed its 2-lobed form, now trained on it during the very hours it is being stressed. Telescopes around the world will track its brightness as it tumbles, watching for the subtle flickers that betray a changing spin or a freshly exposed surface. Between the ground, the spacecraft, and the human eye, almost nothing about that evening will go unrecorded. We are bringing every kind of eye we have. That shared act of witnessing is not a footnote. It changes the meaning of the whole thing. For most of human history, the sky was something that happened to us, that we could only interpret after the fact, through fear or myth, or, much later, through instruments. On the night of April 13th, 2029, 2 billion people and a small fleet of robotic explorers are going to watch the same experiment unfold together in real time, knowing what it is and what hangs on it. These are the detectors wired up to the black box. The machines will read the spin and the surface and the hidden interior. The eyes will hold the memory, and every one of them will be pointed at the same question we started with, the question that has been humming underneath this entire story, waiting for the planet to force an answer. What is actually inside the god of chaos? We are about to be in the best possible position we have ever been in to find out, and that is exactly why the stakes of getting it right reach so far beyond this one rock. Part 8. The Black Box and the God of Chaos. Let me pull all the threads together now, because once you see them side by side, the picture they form is remarkably clear and a little haunting. The shape that should not be there. two lobes joined at a fragile neck, the density that is far too low for solid stone, the 40% of the body that may be nothing but empty space, the tumble that does not match a uniform rock and instead carries the fingerprint of a lumpy, uneven interior. Every single one of those clues, gathered from different instruments over different years, points to the same conclusion. Apophis is not a mountain. It is a loosely bound heap of rubble, held together by the faintest grip, and its interior, the arrangement and the strength of what lies inside, is something we have never measured and currently cannot predict. So let me return to the word I started with, the nervousness, and tell you what it really is, now that you have the whole picture. It is not the fear that Apophis is going to hit us, because it is not. The orbit is clean for a century, and I would not have spent 2 hours with you pretending otherwise. The nervousness is the tension of a one-time, unrepeatable measurement, performed on the most studied dangerous asteroid in human history, with no rehearsal and no second chance, where the outcome depends entirely on the one property we have never been able to see. It is the suspense of a scientist who has built a beautiful experiment and genuinely does not know what the result will be. That is a rare and uncomfortable feeling in a field that prides itself on prediction, and it is exactly the feeling Apophis is producing right now. I want to take a moment to deal directly and fairly with the louder version of this story, the version that says none of this was disclosed to you, that the inconsistencies were buried, that you are only finding out because someone connected the dots that the authorities did not want connected. I understand the appeal of that framing, and I want to treat it with respect, but I also have to tell you the truth, and the truth is that it is simply not what happened. Every piece of this story, the radar shape, the low density, the rubble pile interpretation, the strange tumble, the predictions of spin change, the stress concentrating at the neck, all of it was published openly in scientific papers that anyone can read. It was discussed at planetary defense conferences held in public. It is, in fact, the entire reason these two spacecraft are being sent in the first place. Nobody hid the inconsistencies. The inconsistencies are the headline of the research. The reason it feels like a secret is not that it was concealed. It is that it was written in the technical language of a field that very few people outside it ever read. The data was always there. What was missing was someone to tell you about it in plain language, which is the whole reason this channel exists. And honestly, the real story is far more interesting than any cover-up could ever be. A cover-up implies someone already knows the answer and is keeping it from you. The truth is stranger and more humbling than that. Nobody knows the answer. Not the agencies, not the modelers, not me, not anyone. The most studied dangerous asteroid in the history of our species is still, at its very core, a sealed box, and the only key that fits the lock is a planetary encounter we have to wait years to witness. There is no secret being kept, because there is no secret to keep. There is only a question, hanging open, waiting. And the one honest crack in all our confidence is not a conspiracy either. It is simply that the interior is unmeasured, and that there remains a small, real chance that some object we have not yet spotted could give Apophis a tiny gravitational nudge before the encounter. That is not a hidden danger. That is just the frontier of what we know, and the frontier always has a ragged edge. Now here is why this matters far beyond one rock and one night, and why the scientists are not only nervous, but frankly, thrilled. 2029 is a free dress rehearsal for the most important skill our species may ever need to learn. Somewhere out there, on some orbit we may not have mapped yet, there is an asteroid with our name on it. Not Apophis, but something, someday. And if we ever have to deflect such an object to nudge it off a collision course, the single most important thing we will need to know is what these bodies are made of inside, because you cannot push a rubble pile the same way you push a solid rock. Push a loosely bound heap too hard in the wrong place, and you might not deflect it, you might just break it into several pieces that arrive separately. The interior is everything, and Apophis, by letting the Earth squeeze it in front of all our instruments, is about to give us our first real lesson in the hidden mechanics of these objects, a lesson paid for by gravity instead of by disaster. The rehearsal is free. The real performance, if it ever comes, will not be. We have in fact already taken the very first step in learning to push back, and it shows you exactly why the interior matters so much. In 2022, NASA flew a spacecraft called DART straight into a small moonlet named Dimorphos, orbiting a larger asteroid on purpose at thousands of kilometers per hour. It was the first time humanity ever deliberately changed the orbit of a celestial body, and it worked. The little moonlet's orbit shifted measurably. But here is the lesson that surprised even the people who ran it. Dimorphos turned out to be a loosely bound rubble pile, and when the spacecraft hit it, it did not just punch a neat crater, it splashed. It threw out an enormous plume of debris, a tail of rubble flung into space, and that recoil actually pushed the asteroid harder than the impact alone would have. The softness of the body changed everything about how it responded to being shoved. Now think about what that means for the day we might actually need to deflect something. If you try to nudge an asteroid off a collision course, the way it responds depends entirely on what it is made of inside. Hit a solid rock, and it moves like a solid rock. Hit a loose rubble pile, and it might absorb the blow or splash, or worse, break into several pieces that keep coming on slightly different paths, turning one threat into many. You cannot plan that maneuver without knowing the interior, and we have just spent 2 hours establishing that the interior is the one thing we cannot see from afar. So when Apophis lets the Earth squeeze it in 2029, and we watch how its spin flips and whether its neck shifts and how its surface slides, we are not just satisfying our curiosity about one rock. We are learning to read the kind of object we will one day have to move. The gravity of the Earth is about to run, for free, the experiment we would otherwise have to pay for with a mission or with a city. This is why the people who study these objects talk about the 2029 encounter the way astronomers once talked about a rare eclipse. It is a once-in-a-generation alignment of opportunity, a chance to learn something we cannot learn any other way, on a famous object with years to prepare. The kinetic impactor, the deliberate punch that DART proved, is one tool. A gentler approach, a so-called gravity tractor that would hover near an asteroid and tug it almost imperceptibly, with its own faint pull over years, is another. But every one of these tools is only as good as our understanding of what we are pushing, and that understanding is exactly what Apophis is about to hand us. Step back far enough, and there is something almost philosophical in it. We tend to imagine the solar system as a place of solid worlds, planets and moons and rocks, hard things moving through empty space. But the more closely we look at the small bodies, the asteroids like Apophis and Itokawa and Bennu, the more we find that many of them are not solid at all. They are rubble, barely held together, more pile than stone. We live in a neighbourhood of loosely bound debris, drifting on long orbits, occasionally passing close. And one of those piles of debris, named for the Serpent of Chaos, is going to come close enough in 2029 to let our planet take hold of it, and in that grip, finally, tell us a little of what it really is. There is a longer perspective worth holding here too, because Apophis is not just a hazard or a science experiment, it is a piece of the beginning. Bodies like this are leftovers, fragments of the raw material that the planets formed from more than 4.5 billion years ago, material that never got swept up into a world. When we study the composition of Apophis, that stony mixture so similar to the meteorites that fall to Earth, we are looking at a sample of the same stuff that built the ground under your feet. The rubble pile passing over the Atlantic that night is, in a real sense, a relic of the construction site that made us. To reach out and read its interior is to read a page from the oldest chapter of the solar system's story, a chapter that is normally sealed away in objects too small and too distant to ever examine. And maybe that is the part that should stay with you, more than any single number. We are a species that has mapped this object's path for the next century, that can tell you where a mountain of rock will be on a specific Friday evening 4 years from now, down to the kilometre, after it has travelled hundreds of millions of kilometres around the sun. We are that powerful, and in the same breath, we have to admit that we do not know what it is made of inside, that our most confident predictions about its behaviour come with a quiet asterisk, that we are going to learn the answer not by figuring it out in advance but by watching, in real time, and seeing what it chooses to do. There is a humility in that which I find genuinely moving. We have built the most precise picture of the heavens in human history, and it has led us, in the end, to a closed box we cannot open by thinking, only by waiting. That tension between how much we know and how much we still cannot see is the real reason this story matters, and it is the reason the people who study it are watching the calendar tick toward 2029 with a feeling that sits somewhere between excitement and unease. They are not afraid, they are expectant. They have set up the most elaborate observation of a single rock in the history of their field, and they are waiting to find out whether the god of chaos confirms what they think they know or surprises them. And there is something almost unprecedented in the simple fact that we get to prepare for this at all. For all of human history, the objects that fell from the sky came without warning. A flash, a shock, a crater, and then the slow work of figuring out what had happened. Always after the fact. Always too late to do anything but survive it or not. Apophis is different in a way that should not be lost on you. We saw it coming 25 years out. We argued about it, measured it, cleared it, and then turned the whole event into a planned act of science. We are perhaps for the first time meeting one of these visitors on our own terms, with instruments ready and eyes open, having chosen in advance exactly what we want to learn from it. That is a kind of power our ancestors could not have dreamed of, the power to turn a thing that once would have been read as an omen into an experiment we run on purpose. But it is a power with a clear edge to it, and the edge is the reason none of this is merely academic. Somewhere out there, on an orbit we may not yet have drawn, there is very likely an object that is not going to miss. Not Apophis, but something, someday, on some year that no one has circled yet. When that day comes, everything we manage to learn in 2029, every secret we pry out of this one rubble pile about how these bodies hold together and how they come apart, becomes the difference between a deflection that works and one that scatters a single threat into many. The serpent that misses us is teaching us how to face the one that might not. That is why the scientists are not just curious. They are aware that this free lesson handed to us by gravity is one we'd better not waste. So picture it one more time the way we began. April 13th, 2029, a Friday. Across Europe and Africa, the evening comes on, the stars appear, and then there is a point of light that does not belong, moving, climbing, brighter than the handle of the Big Dipper, sliding across the sky faster than anything up there should. 2 billion faces turn upward. 2 spacecraft hold their formation in the dark beside it. And for a few hours, a planet and a ghost meet, the way they have met countless times before in the long history of the solar system, except that this time, for the very first time, someone is watching closely enough to understand. We will not know what we're seeing until we see it. The most famous asteroid we have ever found is still a black box, and we have to wait for the Earth itself to open it. The serpent has been circling for 22 years, since the night we first caught it on a mountaintop in Arizona. In 2029, it comes close enough to touch, and the only question left is whether, when the planet finally squeezes the god of chaos, we will be ready to read the answer it gives, or whether it will whisper its secret once in the dark above the Atlantic and carry the rest of it back out into the night.